Let's talk about ketones as a whole right now and give a 101. And for somebody wondering, what is a ketone? Have I ever produced one in my body? Let's begin there and talk about what they are.
Okay. Well, first of all, even when you're a fetus, you produce ketones in your body. So they've been documented all the way back to at least 12 weeks of gestation, that the growing, developing baby in the womb, actually has ketones already in their blood. And the mother during pregnancy is in ketosis, in mild ketosis. And um, ketones are building blocks of fats. For example, in the newborn brain, ketones are the building blocks for the lipids in the brain. It's really quite interesting. So they're extremely important to the fetus and the newborn. And, for that reason, and as a source of energy. When a newborn is first born, if they're strictly breastfed, they go into ketosis within about 10 to 12 hours, and they stay on ketosis for a prolonged period of time. And babies, they're fat when they're born, they tend to be fat. And the breast milk actually has medium chain fatty acids in them that are converted to ketones. So this is what the baby is getting, and the baby's in ketosis, which is really quite interesting. Um, so where ketones come from are from fat, basically. So we have, if we didn't have fat and we stop eating, say we're continuing to drink some water, but we're fasting, we stop eating, or our ancient ancestors had periods of famine where they really had no food for a week or two sometimes. Um, if we didn't have fat, we would start breaking down muscle to make, to release amino acids that could be converted to glucose. And if we didn't have fat over about 7 to 10 days, we would deplete all of the glucose and basically muscle in our body, and we would die. However, we do have fat, and fat is a tremendous opportunity to store fuel in our bodies, that can be broken down as we need it. And so it allows muscle to be preserved, at least to some extent if you're starving. And when you have depleted the glucose, mainly in the liver, and then also, some of the glucose in the muscle, you start releasing fatty acids. The fat starts getting broken down, it releases fatty acids. And fatty acids can fuel almost all the organs in the body. The heart uses actually seems to prefer fatty acids. The kidneys prefer fatty acids. Muscle can use fatty acids, um, but they're larger particles and they don't cross that blood-brain barrier. They don't cross into the brain very well. So the brain needs another source of fuel. Otherwise, it would we would die. From that problem. That our brains would die. So part of the fatty acids that are released, are taken to the liver and converted to ketones. And it's kind of like taking the fatty acids with the scissors and cutting them, a little tiny piece at a time. And ketones are very tiny molecules. They're actually smaller than glucose molecules, and they very easily cross the blood-brain barrier. And cells in the brain don't require insulin to get ketones into the cell or into the mitochondria. I mean, don't require insulin. They don't require insulin to get ketones into the cell or into the mitochondria. So they very efficiently get into the brain and into brain cells and into mitochondria to make ATP. And they very literally enter that same cycle, that glucose enters to create ATP. Fatty acids do this as well, just not so much in the brain. These longer chain fatty acids from fat. So basically, that's kind of where ketones come from. And a lot of people think of, well, what about? I mean, if you have diabetes, high ketones are supposed to be a bad thing, and that's true with diabetic ketoacidosis. But the problem in that situation is that somebody that develops diabetic ketoacidosis has no insulin. They're not putting out any insulin, and they're not getting insulin. This can happen sometimes, say, an elderly person, that's has a memory impairment. They might forget to give themselves insulin for several days. And, then, so the insulin is depleted, glucose level is extremely high, and what happens is the fat starts breaking down very rapidly because none of the cells basically are getting glucose. They're not getting fuel from glucose because the glucose literally cannot enter the cells because of the lack of insulin. So fat starts breaking down very rapidly, and it just rapidly starts producing ketones. And then ketones are acids, and this tends to build up, and then the blood becomes very acidic, and it can be fatal. I mean, this is why people with type 1 diabetes died. It was always fatal before insulin was available, which came along around 1921. There were actually studies of doing a ketogenic diet to help people with type 1 diabetes before insulin came along, and then it kind of went by the wayside because they didn't have to worry about that, with insulin. So, ketones at normal levels, physiological levels, are not harmful. They're helpful. They're very beneficial and necessary, in some cases if you're fasting or don't get to eat for a few days.
All right, well, this is all starting to come together really nicely here.
Yeah.
Early on, we talked about the different challenges when it comes to glucose in the brain, one being the blood brain barrier, and then that glucose, if it does get past that, getting into the cell. And then you talked about that cascade in the cell that it has to go through, and then challenges with mitochondria. And what you've just said here is ketones, they can go right past the blood brain barrier. They don't need to be facilitated through with insulin like glucose. And you've clearly described this other pathway that the ketone can take with very little or no resistance,
Mhm.
providing another fuel for the brain, which is why this is all so important and exciting.
Right. Most of us, if we're eating a high carbohydrate diet, are not in ketosis, maybe ever. A lot of people, if you fast overnight, say at least 10 hours, 12 hours, you don't eat anything with glucose in it. You maybe drink water here and there. You'll be in mild ketosis in the morning. But a lot of people eat up till the time they go to bed. Some people get up during the night and eat something, and they'll eat first thing in the morning when they wake up. There's really no opportunity for it to break down fat to produce ketones. So some people have really no opportunity basically to be in ketosis, and then what you eat affects that as well. Um, we People used to eat whole milk and whole dairy products. And then around 1961, the American Heart Association started telling us to eat a low fat diet and to eat non fat dairy and very low fat dairy. Well, dairy is basically the fat in dairy is milk fat. As I mentioned before, human milk has medium chain triglycerides in it. Well, so does the milk of cows and goats and sheep and horses. Mammals, have these medium chain fatty acids in the milk that are converted to ketones. So if you're eating full fat and whole fat cheeses and whole fat yogurt, you're getting some medium chain triglycerides that are converted to ketones. So there's if you're eating, skim milk and reduced fat, everything, you have basically very little opportunity to get these medium chain fatty acids. And then at this point might be a good time to mention coconut oil.
Yeah, let's get there in one sec. I want to highlight one more important point that I meant to highlight before. The thing that makes the brain unique too is the fact that you mentioned this when you were going through the whole overview there of ketones, the fact that fatty acids can't get in there. So that makes it unique compared to the other areas of the body that even if you're insulin resistant, at least there's still two fuels that can go through the rest of the system. The brain's unique when it comes to things like mental health and dementia because when you can't get fatty acids in there and you have problems with glucose metabolism, that's why ketones become even more important in that specific example.
Exactly. And you know, that they're beneficial even to other organs outside the brain. The only organ that doesn't use ketones is the liver, which is where ketones are produced. So it's good that the liver doesn't use ketones because then there really wouldn't be an opportunity for them to get to the brain and to the other organs. But the heart, you know, there are PET scans now showing that when the ketone levels elevated, that the heart is eagerly taking up ketones, as are the kidneys. So, you know, these organs know how to use ketones, and they can all switch over immediately from using glucose to ketones.
As you share that, it gets me thinking about the poor brain who can only rely on the two sources of fuel. And the
Right.
heart, you're talking about how it loves ketones. What happens when we start producing ketones? How does the body partition and decide what gets what? Because the brain seems to be in a position where it should have priority.
Yeah. So fatty acids, you know, are converted to acetyl CoA, and ketones are converted to acetyl CoA before they enter that cycle, you know, to make ATP. Um, so the from the studies that I have seen, one of the things that happens when you're in ketosis is that it greatly increases blood flow to the brain. So I think that this is a way for the ketones to get directly into the brain. And there's a lot of research Dr. Stephen Cunnane has done. He's in Sherbrooke University in Canada with glucose and ketone PET scans. And he's, you know, been able to show that the higher the ketone level is, the greater the ketone uptake is in the brain. So the blood level has a lot to do with how much gets into the brain. But if you're, you know, like say you're very physically active, um, you might be using ketones too for your muscles and heart and other things. But um, it just seems like the increased blood flow to the brain might explain how the brain preferentially takes up ketones there, you know, which allows other organs, you know, the other organs can use the fatty acids and might not need the ketones, you know, so to speak, as much as the brain does. So there's probably some physiologic reason why that happens. And it could be that the increased blood flow to the brain explains that.
Initially, when you talked about the production of ketones, you talked about that being a process where fat on the body is used to make those. And then later on, you brought in certain foods containing MCTs that can make the ketones as well. So, talk about the difference there. And then, depending on diet, I would assume it would be a different percentage of ketones being made from body fat versus diet. So, break that area down for us.
Yeah. Well, yeah, that's, yeah. So I'm not sure I have all the answers to that, but you know, basically, there are certain fats that when you consume them, they are converted to ketones, and these are medium chain fatty acids. Long chain fatty acids are only converted to ketones normally when you're in a state where you're relatively depleted of glucose stores in your body. You know, like the overnight fasting, you'll start breaking down some fat because you've literally run out of glucose, your storage of glucose. To be immediately available. Um, there's still, you know, the possibility of making glucose from muscle and all of that, you know, but basically, when the liver's depleted, you'll start breaking down some fat, you know, to produce that. Um, so when somebody goes, for example, on a ketogenic diet, they're manipulating the fat and the carbohydrate in the diet. There's a huge spectrum really of the ketogenic diet, and the classic diet was born in 1921, so to speak. The same um, groups that were involved with the ketogenic diet for epilepsy were also somewhat involved with people with type 1 diabetes as well, and endocrinologists. And they discovered that when you eat a very high fat diet, that it mimics fasting. And fasting had been used for epilepsy as a treatment as far back as the Bible and Hippocrates. There are writings about that. You know that if somebody was having seizures, they would fast them for a period of time, and it would stop their seizures. Well, until they could actually measure ketones, they didn't know that that was involved, or what it did to glucose. But in the 19 teens, I guess you could say, they started being able to measure ketones. And they found that people with type 1 diabetes had these high levels of ketones, but people who were fasting had these high levels of ketones. And then they discovered that this eating this very high fat diet also caused ketones to be produced. So that's kind of where it got started, was really treating epilepsy. And the first studies that they did, many there were children and adults that they studied that had drug-resistant epilepsy. There really wasn't much in the way of drugs at that time to control seizures, but they found that this diet would stop seizures in many people, and adults and children. And they put out, writings about this, and then that diet started getting very intensive study, around that time for treating epilepsy. And in the 1940s, more anticonvulsants came along that were relatively effective for most people. And the ketogenic diet was kind of put on the shelf, so to speak, except that just a couple centers in the US, one of them being Johns Hopkins, there were physicians there who and dietitians who continued using the ketogenic diet in children who were not responding to these new anticonvulsant medications. And in the 1990s, early 1990s, something happened to change that. And this was Jim Abrams, who he was the director of some of the really funny movies, Airplane and the Naked Gun series, and Hot Shots, and several of those in the 1990s. And Jim unfortunately just passed away recently, but he was a writer and director of those. And his son Charlie had severe epilepsy. This little child at a year and a half was having sometimes 100 seizures a day. And this is out there. I mean, people are dealing with this, and Charlie had to wear a helmet. He was taking multiple medications. He was very lethargic, and he even had surgery that didn't correct the problem. And his father was constantly trying to read. He would go to the library. We didn't have the internet too much yet at that time, and he would go to the library to try to find a treatment for his son. And he came upon the ketogenic diet, and he had taken his son to 5 neurologists, prominent neurologists throughout the country, and not a single one of them had mentioned this diet as a possibility. So, Jim learned that Johns Hopkins had this program, and they flew, took Charlie there, and they put him on this diet. They used to start with fasting, and they would give him like IV fluid that didn't have glucose in it, and they would fast them to start, and then they would start them on this very high fat ketogenic diet, about 90% fat. And within 48 hours, this little boy completely stopped having seizures. It was really, really quite profound. And he ended up, he was on the diet for, they tried him off of it after 5 years, completely seizure free during that time. And he started having a little bit of a problem again. They put him on for 2 more years. And when they tried him off again, he never has had another seizure again, and he's now around 30 years old. He works as a teacher's assistant, and, he's doing very well. So Jim was so excited about this, but appalled at the same time that this wasn't a standard treatment, for children like his son. And he developed a foundation. They put out a movie. Meryl Streep happened to be one of his neighbors and friends, and it was called First Do No Harm. And it was about story of kind of a composite of Charlie and other children, and their experience with the resistance that they even got from neurologists at the time when they would asked, could we go on this diet? The neurologist, no, 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 it's unpalatable. It's too hard for the long run. It would discourage them from using it. And Jim started, helped turn that around, with his movie, and he went on Dateline NBC a couple of times to talk about it. And so the message got out there, and a dietitian joined him, Beth Supek-Kania. Has been with the foundation for decades now, and she has and the Charlie Foundation have helped open over 300 centers of ketogenic diet around the world, and scores, I mean, hundreds more dietitians have been trained to use this, and really that was kind of the beginnings of this interest in the ketogenic diet, not just for epilepsy. It turns out that it can be helpful for many other conditions, not to mention just type 2 diabetes and even type 1 diabetes. Being on a ketogenic diet can greatly reduce how much insulin they need and can help keep blood glucose levels much more in control for both type 1 and type 2 diabetes. It's really something.
Just sticking with the brain piece, though, this is another piece of the puzzle. We've talked about mental health, dementia, and now epilepsy. And as we bring all these different pieces in that involve the brain, it's just showing how there is some powerful physiology happening when these ketones are being taken up by the brain and used as an alternative energy source.
Yeah. The blood glucose also tends to get low too. As you increase the fat and lower the amount of carbohydrate, that you're eating, it also reduces blood glucose very substantially. There's Dr. Eric Westman at Duke University. Are you familiar with him?
Yeah, he's been on the show. He's great.
Yeah, so he's helped thousands of people for at least 30 years with type 2 diabetes go into remission such that they can get completely off insulin and their other medications for diabetes by eating a very higher fat, very low carb diet. He puts them on such that less than 20 grams per day of carbohydrates, which would, and then, he has them kind of use added fat of maybe 3 to 5 tablespoons a day. And then they use their own body fat, as part of their fuel, and they'll tend to lose weight, in that way. It's a very, very effective diet. It's a very simple, easy to do diet. I've done it myself. I wanted to try it out, and my ketone levels were the highest they've ever been, really, except when I take a ketone supplement, but just strictly from diet, really good ketone levels just from following his diet. And you don't have to weigh or measure anything, with this diet, which is really nice. But it was basically proteins and certain amount of vegetables, which are relatively limited. That's the main source of carbohydrate in the diet, and fat, and it's just very simple. Um, so it's just phenomenally helpful, for people with diabetes or pre-diabetes or obesity. It helps, reduce body fat. Many people who are obese also have a problem with their blood glucose being elevated, and it has a lot to do with what they're eating, in many cases, not all. Um, but it's really kind of taken off. I think if somebody would have had to have their head in the sand to not know that the ketogenic diet's become very popular in the last maybe 5 or 10 years. And that's kind of, where we are, with the diet. And, there are, many other conditions. You mentioned the psychiatric, illnesses that are now, this is kind of a newer area of research that they are finding phenomenal results, improvements in people who, have major depression, bipolar disorder, schizophrenia, anxiety disorders that go on a ketogenic diet. And they can get off quite a bit of their medication and feel a lot better, when they're eating this type of a diet.
Okay, just to make sure I fully understand creating ketones endogenously within the body, We can cut down on sugars and carbs, and that's going to bring down blood glucose and bring down insulin. So then we can start to burn our body fat, make ketones that way. Independent of that, we can take in MCT oil and produce ketones in the liver. The part I still want clarification though, if somebody's eating, say, a bunch of ribeye steaks, and there may be some MCT in there, you might be able to confirm, I'm not sure, but that's not predominantly the fat in there. Can they use that fat to make ketones?
Yeah. Basically, if you eat less than 50 or 60 grams of carbohydrate a day and you basically replace those calories with fat, you're going to predominantly start burning fat as fuel. And because your body, well, there's an organization, let's see, Institute of Medicine, New York Academy of Medicine. They put out dietary reference values, a huge book. It's like 1,300 pages. And they basically there say that the glucose requirement is about 130 grams a day. And this is, basically from teens all the way up through adults. It's a little bit less in infants and children. So if you don't, if you eat like 50 or 60 grams or less of carbohydrate, but you need 130 grams, some of that you can produce in your body, from gluconeogenesis, triglycerides, which are fats. When they're broken down, the glycerides released, and that can be converted to glucose. So there's other ways that we can make it if we don't eat it. But when we eat these lower levels of glucose, it also tends to allow fat to be broken down. It reduces the insulin level. One thing about high insulin levels is insulin puts fat on your body. It promotes fat to be stored. And if you can get your insulin level down, it allows fat to be released. And ketones themselves directly cause fat to break down, can cause fat to break down. So basically, if you're eating a lower carbohydrate diet and you eat meat that has fat on it, you will, some of that fat could be converted to ketones. If you add MCTs to that, your ketone level might be higher, basically, because you're converting that fat just naturally does convert to ketones. It's not stored as fat. Medium chain triglycerides tend not to be stored as fat. They're either converted to ketones. What isn't converted to ketones in the liver is used directly as fuel. And basically fairly rapidly. And there are some relatively newer studies, done about 7 or 8 years ago, showing that these medium chain fatty acids cross the blood-brain barrier, and they are also taken up used directly as fuel to make ATP. So they can also enter that cycle to make ATP. And this is particularly true for astrocytes, which are the cells that kind of nourish the neurons. They kind of shunt fuel to the neurons and other nutrients, but they can shuttle ketones to the neurons as well. So, you eat medium chain fatty acids, some of it gets to the brain. Astrocytes, which are gabillions of, will take it up and they can convert it to ketones and pass the ketones to the neurons, which is very interesting. So these MCTs can actually be a direct source of energy for the brain as well.
Okay, the part I'm still a little bit unclear on though, other fats besides MCTs, can those be converted to ketones? Or is it just the fat from the body and the MCTs?
The fat from meat could also be converted to ketones
Got it.
under the condition that you're eating lower carbohydrates.
Got it. I wasn't sure if the lower carb was just allowing the fat off the body to enter the bloodstream and then go to the liver and make ketones. But you're saying it's three different parts then. If we're low enough carb, some of the other fats can be converted, plus MCTs, plus body fat.
Right. But MCT, when you take medium chain triglyceride oils or fats with them, that doesn't matter what you eat. Some of it will be converted to ketones. That's the cool part about it. And And then, but there are some studies showing if you eat a higher carbohydrate diet, you might not convert as much of it to ketones, but you will convert some of it to ketones no matter what you eat.
And you mentioned, I think, a few different sources of MCT before. What are the different dietary sources across the board?
Okay. So the richest natural source is coconut oil. And, coconuts, people evolved in tropical parts of the world. Coconuts have been there as a source of food. I mean, they're a huge source of food. I mean, there are some countries, especially, more than 100 years ago, that consumed a third of their diet, or even there was one island, that consumed two-thirds of their diet was coconut. Yeah. And, if you eat a coconut, I think of it this way too, if you eat a coconut, and, or coconut oil and fish, which you would if you're living on an island in the Pacific, um, you'll have all the fatty acids that you could possibly need. You get the essential omega-3 fatty acids from the fish, and the coconut actually has some omega-6 fatty acids in it, but it's about let's see, 60%, 65% of the fat in coconut oil are medium chain triglycerides. So, it's a very interesting oil for many reasons, but that's the one that, got me interested in, using this, and then MCT oil is extracted from coconut oil. So now there are different processes, but like one of them, probably the best quality process, I guess you might call it, is, distillation. They can, heat it and distill off the different, um, types of medium chain fatty acids. They can separate the fats in coconut oil. And in years gone by, and still presently, for example, lauric acid, it's half of the fat in coconut oil. Lauric acid is highly antimicrobial. And if you buy antiviral wipes or sprays, there's a good chance that they have sodium lauryl sulfate in it. And lauryl is lauric acid from coconut oil. It's also used as a surfactant for laundry detergents. It's used in soaps and skincare products, oral care products, because of its antimicrobial effects. And coconut has a the coconut oil has a moisturizing effect. So you see this in an awful lot of products. So that's just kind of an example. The industry, has been separating these components for a long time. Well, back in the 1950s, when they would separate coconut oil, the medium chain fatty acids seemed to be a waste product. They didn't know what they could do. And in the 1960s, they, instead of just throwing it out, they thought maybe there's some therapeutic benefits to this, and they started looking for this. And there was a particular group, Dr. Theodore Van Italy, Dr. Sammy Hashem, and others who started studying the properties of medium chain fatty acids. And throughout the 1960s, they spent 10 years, you know, um, intensively studying these fats. And they are the ones who discovered that when you consume them, that the liver converts parts of this to ketones. This was around 1967. And they also started using them for post-surgical care. Some people didn't tolerate fats, people with fat malabsorption syndromes, adults and children and infants would absorb these medium chain fatty acids very well, and it would really help. It would provide nutrition to them and help them survive, these malabsorption syndromes. And they also discovered that premature newborns um, absorb medium chain fatty acids very well, and that they grow faster if they are given these. And when you think about they're in human breast milk, so this is a way to get these very important fatty acids from breast milk into a newborn who can't, um, who isn't getting, breast milk, perhaps. I'm a neonatologist, so I took care of sick and premature newborns for 30 years. And back in the 1980s, when I was, well, late 70s, when I was doing my training, this was new information. And we started adding some medium chain triglyceride oil to each of the feedings of our tiniest preemies. These were babies under 2 pounds, and they would grow faster. They'd get home faster. And then the formula manufacturers started adding them directly to infant formulas for premature newborns, and then for healthy full-term newborns, they started adding them, and they started also adding coconut oil to try to provide these medium chain fatty acids that are in breast milk. This all happened, like, in the 1980s. So, it's been, basically today, almost, virtually every infant formula throughout the world, has, coconut oil in it. And if it's designed for, like, a newborn that's not tolerating feedings, they also have medium chain triglycerides also for, premature newborns. And, there's another oil, it's called palm kernel oil that can also be it has the is very rich in medium chain fatty acids, not quite as much as coconut oil, and the palm kernel oil, like, a lot of people are familiar with palm oil, which comes from the palm fruit. So there's, like, an orange, fruit, um, it's relatively small, they come in bunches on trees, but at the center of it is called the palm kernel, like, palm oil from the palm fruit has virtually no medium chain fatty acids, but the palm kernel is very rich in medium chain fatty acids. It looks white, it looks a lot like coconut, but it's small, and they can extract the medium chain fatty acids from that as well, and some MCT oils are made from this palm kernel oil, and sometimes you'll see it in, infant formulas and other foods, you might see this. I've seen it fairly often on labels, candies and other things like that often have it.
Okay, so far palm kernel oil, coconut oil, great source, breast
Right.
milk. I think earlier you mentioned a couple other animal products that contain it.
Goats are very especially rich in medium chain fatty acids, cow milk, sheep and, horses, all basically all mammals, they'll have some medium chain fatty acids in the breast milk, in their breast milk.
Any other plants?
There are other oils, there's an oil called laurel oil. I don't know that it's used as a food. But there are some in the Amazon too. There are some palms. Ukachuba is one of them. I'm blocking on the other one, but there are a few other oils that have, you know, significant amounts of medium chain fatty acids in them. But basically, the most available is coconut oil. You can like palm kernel oil. I remember getting a container of it, and it was so dry and flaky. It was hard to even get it out to use it like for cooking. Coconut oil is very, like, semi-solid at room temperature in the US if you are looking at 74 degrees, but at 78 degrees, it melts. At, 76 degrees, it starts melting. At 80 degrees, it's completely liquid, like a clear liquid. Um, so, it's really probably the most available at this point, and then, it is possible to get medium chain fatty acids that have most of them are, the 2 fatty acids that are called C8 and C10. C8, is also you can find that by itself. It's highly, ketogenic. It's also more highly prone to causing diarrhea if you try to take too much too fast. And then, lauric acid is C12. It has 12 carbons in the chain. It's half of the coconut oil, and, there are now some products that are high in lauric acid. And, the reason being, that antimicrobial effect. For Alzheimer's, there are numerous organisms that have been studied now that have been implicated as possible causes or contributors to Alzheimer's disease. And lauric acid kills, so many of these that have been studied. It kills viruses like the whole herpes family, herpes simplex, herpes zoster, which is the chickenpox virus. A lot of people develop shingles later in life. It kills dental pathogens that have been implicated in Alzheimer's. So there's a method called oil pulling. You take a teaspoon or two and you work it around in your mouth, and it can help overcome gingivitis. It can greatly reduce gingivitis. It decreases plaque in the mouth, and so it kills these organisms. So, yeah, and it's used in many dental care products, like I mentioned before. And then another interesting thing about lauric acid, there is a company in Japan that they became very interested in my husband. They make MCT oil, and they became very interested in him and how he could have improved so much, from taking coconut oil. And they did some cell culture studies with astrocytes, those cells that nourish the neurons in the brain. And they found that lauric acid potently stimulates ketone production in astrocytes. So these are in cell cultures, and that could explain how taking coconut oil could be so beneficial to the brain, that it might directly provide this fuel as ketones. More study is still needed on that one. But it would be a logical explanation at this point.
If you enjoyed that clip, you're going to want to head over here and catch a full episode. I'll see you over there.
It has been shown since the 1980s that insulin resistance, basically a problem with glucose uptake in the brain, is a big problem for people with Alzheimer's disease. And this is true for many other neurodegenerative disorders. Insulin resistance is a big